I'm very, very concerned that the vast majority of academics are completely unaware of the different ways that the CCP, the PRC, is actually trying to control, in a sort of a distant way, trying to pull the strings to shape what is going on within our universities.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, Michelle Shipworth on Chinese Communist Party interference in British universities.
The CCP is reaching in and having a say. And then one of the ways that they try to control this is by this threat of withdrawal of the student fees. Actually, the Chinese embassies will put pressure, overt pressure, and say, we're going to stop our students coming to your university or even your country in some cases, unless you change your stance on X, Y, or Z.
Michelle says Chinese students cannot escape the threat of the CCP, even in Britain.
Our Chinese students in the classrooms, they never know who of their peers are listening in on what they say in case they say something that the PRC might not like, and that they might actually get reported back to the embassy if they say something that's considered to be wrongthink, and that actually can be incredibly dangerous for students but also for their families.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders, I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Michelle Shipworth, Associate Professor of Energy and Social Sciences at University College London. Michelle, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So you're an Associate Professor, but you were banned from teaching your own course. Can you talk us through what happened?
Yeah, sure. I've been teaching this course for already 10 years, and I introduced a teaching exercise that I'd used for 10 years, where I asked the students, why are there so many slaves in China? And on the slide that I put up at the same time, there was a world map from the Global Slavery Index from 2014 that coloured in China as being medium low for slavery, but also claimed on this map that China was number 2 in the world for slavery. And I put this up because I expected the students to disagree with it. In fact, I disagreed with it because at the time I was unaware of there being any meaningful slavery in China. And so I expected the students to disagree with it. I wanted the students to disagree with it because there's research that shows that if you disagree with a factual claim, you are more likely to put a lot of effort into showing why that claim is wrong.
Right.
And in fact, there's also research that shows that students that have studied in China actually have been exposed to less critical thinking, less critical evaluation of claims, because the Chinese education system doesn't place a very high value on that skill set, whereas in the UK education, particularly at the master's level, I teach at the master's level, you need those skills if you're going to get the very top marks. And I want our Chinese students to have just as much opportunity to get the top marks as all of our other students. So I hope that the Chinese students, but all of the students, would disagree with the claim and that would motivate them to tell me why the claim was incorrect. And so the students were doing that. I did that as well. We had a great class. We get to the end of the class, and one of the Chinese students stood up and in a slightly cross voice said, "Why did you ask such a horrible question in the first instance?" And I thought, well, this is a great question because it gives me a chance to explain the pedagogy behind what I was doing. So I explained to him what I told you at the outset, that actually there's this theory called disconfirmation bias. There's lots of good research evidence that shows if you disagree with a claim that's being made, you're going to want to prove that that claim is incorrect, so you're going to put lots of effort into disproving the claim. That was what I wanted you to do as the students, and you did a really fantastic job, so well done. And I thought that that was the end of it.
And then what happened next?
Yes, it didn't stop there. So what I then heard was initially, I heard from colleagues that a student had complained, and then they told me a few students had complained, and then a lot of students had complained. I was really surprised by this because I'd had many, many hundreds of students do this teaching exercise, including hundreds of Chinese students do this teaching exercise, and none had complained over a 10-year period. And so I was really surprised by that. And then my colleagues decided that they really needed to respond to these students who were complaining. So they turned off my own access to my own teaching module, my own module that I had invented and taught for the previous 10 years. They turned off my access to that. And I insisted on getting my access back so that I could teach my students again. And then we had the final seminar for the year. And during that final seminar, what was really interesting is that the student who had complained in the week before, and who my colleagues were telling me was very distressed by the exercise and by me, that student came in surrounded by his friends. They were all grinning really widely, looking me straight in the eye and grinning at me and laughing, and came right to the front of the classroom and sat there grinning and laughing at me. Now, I felt that this is quite unusual behaviour for students who were actually, as my colleagues told me, students who were afraid of me and worried about me and worried about the exercise. That struck me as unusual behaviour. But nonetheless, I went ahead with that class. We finished that class. In fact, it was a very successful class. We stayed back for an hour longer than we should have, so I thought that was a very successful class and thought, great, okay, we're past all of this. And then a week later, my colleagues met with me and absolutely insisted that I drop the exercise for future years. So even though I had excellent written evidence that this was a really good learning exercise for the students, so the students responded really well, they had great lessons learned from the exercise, they were going to be, they were all sorts of practical ways they were going to implement the lessons learned in their data detective assignments. So I was really surprised that my colleagues were insisting that I drop this exercise on the basis of one or two students who I think started the whole complaint off, when clearly this was a great learning exercise. But I ended up caving in and agreeing to that because I felt under such pressure from my colleagues. And that was the end of it. For a few months. And then a few months later, I was in a meeting with very senior UCL colleagues, and we were discussing, in fact, academic freedom in the classroom. And I brought up what had happened in my case. And all of the senior academic colleagues, including the provost, agreed that, in fact, my academic freedom had been infringed and should not have been infringed, and that this was evidence that UCL needed better training on academic freedom. And I said that I thought we probably also needed some stronger policies on it as well. And after that meeting, I sent an email to the colleagues involved, the departmental colleagues who were involved in turning off my access to my own module, and who had insisted that I change the teaching exercise for future years. I sent all of them an email, including the head of department, saying, look, the senior colleagues in UCL do think that my academic freedom was infringed and that it should not have been. And 2 days later, there were report and support allegations submitted against me by colleagues.
So they complained against you? They
complained against me, claiming out of the blue that I was biased against Chinese students, even though my colleagues know that I supervised 3 Chinese PhD students. I've supervised many Chinese master students. I have overseen the teaching of hundreds of Chinese students. There's never been any single complaint over that period of time. And the so-called evidence that they submitted against me was the teaching exercise that I'd been using for 10 years, me asking Chinese students to contribute in class, just like I ask all of my other students to contribute in class, and me picking up a couple of contract cheating cases and thinking that there might have been a couple more Chinese students who might have been engaging in contract cheating, potentially. And there were 2 that definitely had been and were evicted from UCL on that basis.
What's contract cheating?
Contract cheating is when a student pays someone else to do their work for them.
Oh, right.
And you can sort of notice the difference between the students' contributions in class, the verbal contributions in class, or just their ability to answer questions about their own work, where there's a difference between what they're able to explain to you when you're in person with them, whether in a wider setting or in a one-to-one setting. There's a difference between what they can explain to you about their work and their written work, when there's quite a big difference in those. Not when there's small differences, of course, because we can all forget things, but then when there's enormous differences, you can pick that up, and that's how I picked that up in those other cases.
So you'd found some people cheating, they happen to be Chinese, and you're getting called anti-Chinese.
Exactly. So I was absolutely flabbergasted by this, and my head of department then investigated this. He concluded that, in fact, there was no evidence that I was biased against Chinese students, but despite finding that there was no evidence, he basically concluded that because there was a perception of bias against, that I was biased, simply a perception that I was biased, and because we needed to protect our income and we needed to make sure that Chinese students wouldn't be dissuaded from coming to our department, that in fact he was going to take me off the module on that basis, as well as impose other restrictions on my academic freedom. So it was at that point that I felt I couldn't think of any other place to turn. At the time, and still to this day, we don't have anyone in UCL who's in charge of academic freedom, so I felt I had nowhere to turn. So at that point in time, I turned back to the Free Speech Union, who had been helping me earlier on as well. I turned to them, and they felt that pretty much the only thing that I could do at that point was to go public. So I went public, and the Telegraph kindly put my story on the front page of the Telegraph on the weekend. And then after that went public, UCL did an investigation into what had happened in this case. And although they found that my academic freedom had been somewhat infringed, I still don't have the module back. There is no sign that that module is going to be given back to me, and in fact no one is teaching that content now. So none of our students are learning how to do critical evaluation of factual claims or secondary data. And these are students that are using secondary data in almost all of their energy models and their environment models. So they need the skills to critically evaluate that data, and they're not getting those skills.
So you'd mentioned your supervisor said protect our income. I think UCL has the highest number of Chinese students in the UK, over 10,000, paying up to £40,000 a year each, so it's quite a lot of money. Do you think there's issues of dependence on their income influencing how complaints are handled?
Yeah, most definitely. It was only after that I went public that I started looking into these sorts of issues, to be honest, because prior to this, like I think most academics, I just wasn't paying any attention. I knew that we had large numbers of Chinese students, but it had never caused any particular problems. It was, the Chinese students had always been extremely hardworking, very easy to get along with, etc., etc. I hadn't really looked into it, and I hadn't really thought of, are we too dependent on one particular country for our income? So I started looking into it, and I actually found that when you've got a very large number of students coming from an authoritarian, increasingly authoritarian state, then that does actually raise a number of issues. And in fact, there's been a lot of very significant reports now that have come out of the UK and the US and the Australian parliaments, for instance, security committees, foreign affairs committees, and those looking into the influence of authoritarian states on academia. When you're talking about the PRC, they actually operate what is termed the United Front Work Department, which is kind of a department and kind of this very dispersed set of organizations that reach into both inside China and outside. So my concern is outside China. I'm not particularly interested, it must be said, on what's going on within China, although I am increasingly concerned about various human rights abuses within China, which I was quite ignorant of previously. But since I've gone public, I've then been looking into it and found that there actually are a range of human rights abuses, including that there is meaningful slavery in China, which I was I'm sorry to say, I was very ignorant of it previously. But these series of reports opened my eyes to what's going on in terms of the tentacles of this united front work department within China, but outside China as well, including in the UK and including into academia. So they've got these various ways of infiltrating into academia. And one of these ways, for instance, is to operate through the Chinese Students and Scholars Association.
Right.
So almost every university has one of these student associations that are nominally placed within the student unions, but they're not a normal student union organisation, because pretty much all of these CSSAs, or Chinese Students Associations, pretty much all of them are guided or somewhat controlled and slightly funded by the Chinese embassy, which basically means the CCP and the PRC, so that they have a much more controlling stake than you might expect. And they although they do lots of good things as well for the students, so the Chinese Students Association, they do lots of nice things for the students as well. I've had my own students go along to some of the events. I know, one of my students met her boyfriend at one of them. There's some lovely things that they do for the students as well. But in addition to doing some really lovely things, they also are keeping an eye on the students. They're also monitoring the students. And we've ended up, and particularly Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have highlighted that, in fact, our Chinese students in the classrooms, they never know who of their peers are listening in on what they say, in case they say something that the PRC might not like, and that they might actually get reported back to the embassy if they say something that's considered to be wrongthink, and that actually can be incredibly dangerous for students, but also for their families, because in fact the Chinese government will take action against the families of someone who disagrees with. It's not just the student themselves who is at risk, but it's the families of those students as well. So that's one of the things that these students' associations are able to do and network into so many of the classrooms, including my own classrooms, I assume. So they're able to do that. But the other thing that these student associations do is they're keeping an eye open for any kind of discussion or event that might be taking place either within your classroom or on the university campus, that might be any kind of discussion or event where any view might be aired that the PRC/CCP might not like. And they're keeping an eye open for those, and then they are brought in to swoop down to try to suppress that, to try to prevent it, ever happening again, to try to make sure that it doesn't take place on campus, that those discussions and debates can't be heard. So that's kind of how the Chinese embassy is reaching in to our classrooms. The other way that they're doing it is through another institute that has some very, very good aims, as well as a few really rather problematic aims. And those are the Confucius Institutes, which many, many universities have these Confucius Institutes. UCL has a Confucius Institute, which has the very super aim of language, teaching language and culture, traditional Chinese culture, which is super. But at the same time, unfortunately, these Confucius Institutes are actually funded through the CCP PRC way of operating, through what's called the Hanban, or sometimes they change the terminology. And this is a way of the PRC, again, directing funding into the Confucius Institutes, which are doing largely great things, but also keeping an eye open, ensuring that no debate takes place on campus, a little bit like the students' associations, making sure that there's no kinds of discussion or debates or events that the PRC don't want to have on campus. So anything where you might want to be discussing, say, what might be happening in Tibet or in Xinjiang with the slavery, the forced labor in Xinjiang, those sorts of things, they want to make sure that there's going to be no discussion of those. So that's the Confucius Institutes. So yes, the CCP is reaching in and having a say. And then one of the ways that they try to control this is by this threat of withdrawal of the student fees. So exactly like you were saying, that by having these students' associations and the Confucius Institutes, they are the eyes and ears, and they try to put pressure. But one of the ways that they put pressure, and I know this from a report from someone who was previously a Chinese ambassador. And he actually said that actually the Chinese embassies will put pressure, overt pressure, and say, we're going to stop our students coming to your university or even your country in some cases, unless you change your stance on X, Y, or Z. So definitely the Chinese government uses this threat, uses their own students, if you like, as a way of threatening universities or other governments. And then the other thing that the Chinese government do is they have this tendency, if someone says, is expressing a view that they disagree with, then the Chinese government is inclined to shout racism. And they'll claim that anyone opposing the viewpoint espoused by the PRC is inherently racist. And I saw that coming through in, well, both of those, in fact, coming through in my case. So yes, there are all of these forces, and they generally end up relying on self-censorship because the universities are so concerned about this. But also most academics, like me, wildly unfamiliar with what the issues are. I think if I was teaching anything to do with slavery or China, then I would probably have been aware of these various sensitivities, and maybe I wouldn't have ever trod on this particular landmine. But because it was both slavery and China were totally irrelevant to what I was teaching, I was just trying to get the students to do some critical thinking. So I completely accidentally stood on this landmine, and I'm very, very concerned that the vast majority of academics are completely unaware of the different ways that the CCP, the PRC, is actually trying to control, in a sort of a distant way, trying to pull the strings to shape what is going on within our universities. And that's the reason that I am continuing to speak out, because I am very concerned about the safety of our Chinese students and their families. I'm very concerned about them, and I'm very concerned about what is happening to UK academia, and that we're allowing the traditional academic values of critical thinking to be dissolved in our anxiety to please an authoritarian government.
Do you think there's some Chinese students who are kind of altering their behaviour, self-censoring, maybe even living in fear because of the regime?
Most definitely. I know this from the reports, basically. You know, I've now had a couple of dissidents, Chinese dissidents, reach out to me, people who have been granted refugee status in the UK. And it's really quite heartbreaking to hear of their story. So I know that it is happening. You know, fairly naturally. I mean, and it's only since I've been going public that I've, you know, have ad hoc conversations that I'm not even going to allude to in order to keep people safe. But I am very certain from people who've spoken to me, as well as from the many reports that I've now read, especially those by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, that have highlighted that effectively our Chinese students are living in fear in my classroom.
So if the international students come here, they're coming here because they're interested in the British education,
Yep.
the values of Britain.
Yes.
They're coming to live here for several
Yes.
years. And if we change our values to match those of a communist regime, is it fair on the non-Chinese students, and what will the long-term consequences be?
It's not fair on anyone. It's really not fair on anyone. It's not fair on the Chinese students who are coming here for a British education. They've chosen to come here. They've chosen not to study in China for this particular point. They've chosen to come here, and it's not fair for the overwhelming majority of students who are not Chinese either, because their education is being affected, hugely affected, by an authoritarian regime, by the Chinese government. We're reducing the set of what they're allowed to be taught and how they're allowed to be taught to if you like, sort of bow down to the Chinese government.
What can we do to counter these situations?
Well, one of the things, so very importantly, you know, Amnesty, but particularly Human Rights Watch, came up with I think it was a 10-step plan or whatever, and most of those steps involved steps that universities should be taking to improve academic freedom in our institutions. And in fact, even Universities UK, which is this umbrella body for, I think, all UK universities, in fact, even they came up with a plan that basically said to counter the various threats of the various threats of all sorts of internationalisation, this possibility of the withdrawal of student fees. But some of the important steps that we should be taking to counter these threats from internationalisation is actually to secure academic freedom, that is one of the most important things that we can be doing. And so I was in despair when, a couple of months ago, the UK Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, actually decided to pause the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act and to not implement that immediately, but to look at even possibly repealing that, because I see that as not only being a problem for research in UK universities, but being an extraordinarily huge problem for teaching, and means that our students will be being taught a far more limited set, and I would argue that our students' set of what they can be taught is going to be limited by the PRC in terms of what they're allowed to learn. So I think that's one of the steps that we should be taking, and then the other step that we should be taking is just making sure that people know about the problem as well. We can't protect our Chinese students, we can't protect the value of UK academia, how we teach in UK universities. We can't protect that unless we talk about the problem, which is why I think it's really important to just tell people what's going on.
How has this experience changed your view of the state of academic freedom in Britain?
I've realised that it's in an extremely dire state, and mostly extremely dire because of the self-censorship. So most academics are self-censoring and expect others to self-censor. So I would say that I think that things are much worse than I initially thought.
Do you think what happened to you is a one-off, or do you think there's a lot of other lecturers out there experiencing something similar, maybe not going public, self-censoring?
I don't know on the issue of China, but I do know that when it comes to one single student complaining about X, whatever it is happening in the classroom, that universities are increasingly just caving in to the students' demand, however irrational it is. They're not weighing it up against, well, what is the value of the teaching, what is the value of the learning from this exercise or this module or whatever. Increasingly, we're just caving in to students' demands, irrespective, which means that you're ending up with a very tiny number of students who are effectively able to control and set the agenda. And I think essentially what's happened is that the Chinese government has cottoned onto this, and they've just got wise to what students have been doing in some other areas, whether it's to do with race or gender or, all sorts of particular topics have become sort of almost off limits, if you like. And the Chinese government has just kind of got wise to this strategy, and they're just using pretty much the same strategies that the other students are doing. So I know that it's happening across a very, very wide range of topics, but I also know that it's actually very, very rare for an academic to feel sufficiently confident that they can speak out. So I've had colleagues tell me about what's happened to them, but they did not feel that they could go public, either because they didn't know of something like the Free Speech Union that could support them, or very often I absolutely know of colleagues as well who don't have a permanent job at the university. They'll have some sort of a temporary job. There's many jobs at universities now that are academic roles, but they are not permanent jobs. And so people in those positions are in they're in a very perilous position, that they don't know that they're going to continue to keep their jobs. And in fact, if they speak out in any way against the university in any way, shape or form, then they are at high risk of their contracts not being renewed. So there's a very, very strong incentive for them to keep their mouths shut. So I felt that I was in a position where I could speak out. I hoped, and I continue to hope, that there's a smallish probability of losing my job. I hope that that is the case. But it felt that because that probability of losing my job was, I hope, fairly small, it felt that I had to speak out because this is such a big problem.
If we carry on down this path of pandering to students' whims on things, allowing them to control what is taught and shielding them from ideas they don't like, I mean, where will we end up?
In a very dangerous place where effectively, I mean, I liken it to putting the toddlers in charge of the menu. And I don't mean that as a disrespect to my students, but there's a reason why you have teachers are generally in charge of the class and students are the ones learning. I am all for listening to the contributions of what students have to say. I run most of my classes as a format of discussion. Very often I don't think there's any one right answer. I'm wanting there to be debate and discussion. I don't necessarily think that I have the correct answer. But on the other hand, I do think that I am placed in the position of a teacher for a reason, that we have such a thing as a teacher and a student for a reason, in much the same way that we have such a thing as a parent and a child for a reason, that one is in a position to help the other to learn and to grow. And I see that as my role, is to help the students to grow. And if we allow the students to set the parameters of how that growth can take place, then that is going to enormously limit how that growth can take place. If instead we're helping the students are helping us expand the scope of what we can learn, then I'm all for it.
It feels kind of like, going back to your experience, somewhat things were turned upside down. I mean, the students are controlling what you're allowed to teach, your less experienced colleagues controlling how you're allowed to communicate. I mean, what impact did that have on you?
My mental health took a bit of a nosedive initially, because I can struggle with that a bit, and it's been very difficult because I've had to adjust to sort of feeling like I don't know who I can trust, and in a way, I guess it's very similar to how our Chinese students are experiencing our classrooms, in that they don't know who they can trust, and honestly, it breaks my heart to think that, you know, here are Chinese students, they come to us in good faith, they think that they're studying in a free country, and yet we aren't standing up for their right to have an actual British education, as well as, of course, that of all of our other students as well. So the main impact on me has been an awareness of how important it is to fight for having our British education system remain British and not become some kind of a, colonial claim by the PRC trying to change how we teach and what we teach.
Michelle Shipworth, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.